Hello, everyone. Welcome. We will wait a moment or so for folks to continue trickling in. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat where you're calling in from, and we will get started very soon. Alrighty, I'll get started with a bit of an introduction as folks continue to trickle in. Welcome, everyone, to our deep dive webinar on 2025 state climate policy trends and opportunities. We have a great panel of speakers here to chat with you all. Before I get into the introduction, just want to note captions are enabled. So if you want to show captions, auto transcription, that's available at the button at the bottom of your screen. And then you should be able to send anything you want in the chat. But make sure you can toggle between the hosts and panelists or everyone. So just make sure you're aware of that. And yeah, we can get started on the next slide with a bit of an introduction. If this is your first time, my name is Kristen Suarez. My pronouns are she, they, and I am the State Climate Policy Network Manager here at Climate XChange. I'll go ahead and send a link in the chat to learn more about the SCPN and what we do. And on the next slide, in case it's your first time, I can just provide an introduction to our organization. Climate XChange is a national nonprofit organization focused on passing effective and equitable climate policy at the state level. And so the State Climate Policy Network, or the SCPN, is one of our main national programs for supporting state work, where a network of over 15,000 advocates, legislators, researchers, agency staffers, all sorts of folks working in and around state level climate policy across all 50 states. I sent the link in the chat, climate-exchange.org/network, if you're interested to learn more about what we do. That link will also lead you to recordings and recap articles from past webinars, which are part of our monthly deep dive series, where we pick a specific topic and invite experts to share their experience and knowledge on the topics. And through these events, as well as our monthly national SCPN calls, which will be happening at the end of this month, we really hope to create a space for network members across the country to connect on climate policy and really learn from the vast knowledge and experience held within the national movement of state climate policy actors. I will send my email in the chat, and we can go to the next slide. A couple ways we can help you and support your work, or we can connect you to someone who can. And that's my email in the chat, kristen@climateexchange.org, if you want to reach out with any questions about these things. But Climate Exchange specializes in tracking and analyzing state climate policy, as well as providing connections with experts, advocates, or other actors working on similar issues to you. So we can provide example states or model rules for climate policy. We can provide state landscape analyses and more. We also host the State Climate Policy Dashboard, which is a database of over 60 types of state-level enacted policies across the country, with the ability to sort and filter and compare policies across states and sectors. So that's my intro. We can go to the next slide and get into the conversation. Today, we've invited an amazing panel of speakers to talk about what states need to know related to current trends in climate legislation, regulation, and other policy tools, as well as opportunities for states looking to keep up their ambition in the absence of federal climate support. So before I get into the introduction of our speakers, just a logistical note. Feel free to continue using the chat box as a space for connection, sharing resources. If you have any topic-related questions for the panelists, though, please submit those at any time through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you submit them through the chat, they might get lost. But if you submit them through the Q&A, we might be able to ask our speakers at the end of the event. And this webinar is being recorded. So if you need to hop off, or you know someone who wanted to make it but couldn't, feel free to just sit tight, and we will send you the recording and slides and a recap article by the end of the week. So yeah, today you can see our three amazing speakers here on the left. Every year we host kind of a mid-session trends webinar, trying to pull together policies that are popping up in legislatures across the country. This year we're supplementing that with policies outside of the legislature. So we have our own Ruby Wincele, who'll be kind of highlighting some other policy trends. And then we're also highlighting opportunities for states, situating this webinar not only in the context of what's happening in states themselves, but also in what levers states can pull this year, in the coming years, in the absence of federal climate ambition. Of course, opportunities vary state by state, but it's helpful to kind of understand the pathways to get you to certain types of decarbonization or climate or justice related goals. I'll also be deploying a poll at the end of the event to kind of help us understand which of these trends you all need more support on, or could use for further programming on. So yeah, I will get more into the introductions for each of the speakers before their presentation. But first we'll have Ava Gallo from the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators kind of talking about trends. Then we'll hand it over to our own Ruby Wincele, who will continue the discussion about some other trends outside of the legislature and in. And then we'll hand it over to Alicia Zhao from the Center for Global Sustainability to wrap us up with some opportunities and modeling for states across the country. So we can go to the next slide. And our first presenter is Ava Gallo, who's the National Caucus for Environmental Legislator, or NCEL's Climate and Energy Program Manager, where she works to support legislators across the country on every policy topic under the climate and clean energy umbrella. So Ava, I will hand it over to you and we can go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Kristen. Always love joining this webinar every year. So just to give a little bit of context about who we are at the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators on the next slide. We tagline ourselves as remote environmental staff for state legislators in all 50 states, because generally state legislators are very under-resourced and underpaid. So we try to help fill in those gaps. We work with about 1,200 to 1,300 state legislators from both major parties. And so we're nonpartisan and non-lobby. So really just working at this educational kind of convening standpoint to help legislators learn from each other so that they don't need to reinvent the wheel. So on the next slide, I'm here today representing our climate and energy program, but we also have conservation, environmental health, and oceans programs as well, with environmental justice threaded through. So we're kind of a one-stop shop for all things environmental policy for state legislators. And so today I'm kind of just going to walk through a couple of high-level policy trends that we're seeing across the states right now. I have my lovely coworker who's going to be dropping a lot of links in the chat, Emily, who is our new grid specialist at NCEL, so she can answer any sort of really wonky energy or grid questions. But on the next slide, I'm going to kick it off with looking at polluters pays legislation, which you might have heard around this concept of Superfund legislation, not in the typical sense of, oh, we're remediating Superfunds, but instead of holding fossil fuel companies accountable for the impacts that they have had to communities. And I think that this, I've been calling it sort of the it girl of the legislative session, because I think, as you all are well aware, there is going to be a very steep federal funding gap for climate and energy work, with not only a federal government who is not supportive, but actively oppositional to any climate and energy work. So states have been forced to reckon with the question, where are we going to continue to get the funds to do the work that we know that we need to do? And the Superfund legislation has become really popular. Last year, it passed in Vermont and New York. This year, you can see the map on this page, the states that have introduced it. So far this session, we've been seeing, surprise ones pop into the picture. I think we'll probably see a couple more before the end of the year. But it supports mainly adaptation projects. Some states also include mitigation there. And then some pieces of legislation often have a really high sort of like a Justice 40 or a 35% that goes to disadvantaged communities. And then also sort of on this thread, thinking through how individuals can hold fossil fuel companies accountable. So there are states, Hawaii, California, Oregon, and New York, that are really cementing in this private right of action for individuals that they can sue fossil fuel companies. So kind of all getting at this same, holding fossil fuel companies accountable for the harm that they've done for communities in the past, and remediating those impacts today. So we have a lovely spotlight on there that we can put in the chat. Maybe Emily did already. On the next slide, going to get into transmission. I think that permitting and siting and grid has been a big conversation on the federal level. And although there's a lot around transmission that happens at the federal level, there's really a lot that states can address as well. I often say if you're waiting for the federal government to do something, you might be waiting a very long time. So states are eager to do what they can with the resources they have right now. And as you can see from this map, there are a lot of states from different political backgrounds who are all looking at transmission. It's something that I think if you care about reliability, affordability, economic development, resiliency, transmission gets at a lot of these. So this map here is for states who've introduced grid enhancing technology legislation in 2025. Grid enhancing technologies are kind of like energy efficiency for transmission lines. So it enables existing transmission lines to have a lot more capacity than they would otherwise, which is a cheaper way to get more capacity onto the grid because it can take a really, really long time to permit, site, and get these wires in the ground. So in the meantime, grid enhancing technologies is really sort of a low-hanging fruit possibility there. And then there's a lot of siting and permitting legislation listed these bills and states there. And then transmission authorities you see often in these Western states because they're part of the country that doesn't have a regional grid operator. So there isn't a lot of regional planning happening around transmission. And so if you can have an entity that is, specifically responsible for doing some of that planning, coming up with low cost bonds, low interest bonds for these developers, it can have a really big impact. So Colorado and New Mexico already have transmission authorities, and we see Washington, Oregon, and Montana looking to join that group in this session. I'm sure there's a million different things in the chat. I am gonna answer them at the end, but there might be, Emily, just make sure putting links that go out to everyone instead of hosts and panelists so people can see them. On the next slide, going into more wonky grid things, looking at microgrids and virtual power plants. This is another map of both of those two topics combined. Again, you see sort of an interesting combination of states here with Texas, California, New York, all looking at microgrids and virtual power plants. But I think, again, get at this topic area that is universally something we're trying to achieve across party lines with resilience, energy independence, promoting renewable energy. And there's so much grid instability and high electricity prices right now, particularly with whatever effect tariffs might have on the cost of energy supply. A lot of new generation is getting stuck in the queue, but there's a lot of problems right now. But microgrids and virtual power plants can really help us manage the grid that we have and prepare for these extreme weather events that are continuing to happen. Okay, still on the grid side of things, one more slide here, talking a little bit about data centers. So that has been, I'm sure, what you all have been hearing a lot around this session, and states really have just started thinking about what their levers are for data centers. I think Virginia sort of punted the question last session by having a study. There really weren't that many data center bills until this year. So there's still sort of a discussion on what is the best approach to go. And again, I feel like I'm being a broken record here, but in this political climate, identifying these sort of bipartisan talking points is so important. And I think that data centers, there is a big interest in having that tax revenue wherever they're sited. But I think that folks across the aisle are starting to identify how ratepayers can be on the hook for paying for these grid upgrades, for the energy supply of data centers, when in reality, on the Meta or Google or these other companies are sort of benefiting from putting these costs on ratepayers. So I think looking at that ratepayer protection piece has been really big. Transparency, just understanding how data centers use energy. Is it really 24/7? Are there gaps? A lot of that data isn't available yet, and states can require some of that to get a better understanding of how they can better incorporate into the grid. Again, some of these demand side solutions on energy efficiency, how can we dial up and dial down data centers as the grid peaks or during different times of the day? And then, for some of these more ambitious states, how can we require data centers to use clean energy rather than, there's been discussions of keeping coal plants online or keeping natural gas online or building new natural gas plants to support these data centers. So that's a really big concern. And I highlight this bill from Georgia as a really good example of a bipartisan way this is moving through a red state, which is hyper focused on this ratepayer protection piece. So making sure that the rates of any costs incurred by grid upgrades from data centers aren't going passed on to ratepayers. And that has bipartisan sponsorship and has already passed the committee. So definitely getting some movement, although certainly facing some private backlash there. And I'll end us on a little transportation nugget, which is a bill that I think is really interesting and gets at looking at the transportation sector as a whole. This legislation has previously passed in Minnesota and Colorado, essentially sets either a greenhouse gas or a vehicle miles traveled cap on projects for agencies, for projects funded by state departments of transportation, and us to calculate how a project will increase the VMT of an area. And if it does, the DOT also has to invest in sort of these mitigation opportunities as well, like complete streets, public transit, anything bike ped, things of that nature. So it can really have this funding shift. And this legislation has really started getting some speed because there were a lot of studies done after the passage of the infrastructure bill that saw with a lot of the funding that was there had flexibility, and states could be spending them on things like electric vehicles, and instead we're funneling a lot of that money into expanding highways, which raise some red flags because could cause increased emissions. We know that highway widening is not an effective way to reduce congestion, and it only increases cars on the road. So this is a way to really hold state DOTs accountable and be in line with the greenhouse gas targets that the legislatures are passing. So it's passed in Minnesota and Colorado in previous years, being introduced in Illinois, Maryland, and New York, and I'm thinking it will be introduced shortly in Maine, potentially some others. So a little transportation there for you. And just on the last slide, I feel like that was a lot of top line trends. There's a lot of other things going on in both climate and energy and other topics happening. We have publicly available bill tracking on our website. And even if there's not something on our website, we have a lot of our own internal tracking that we can help, share if it's not easy to find on our website. So this is my email. I can pop it in the chat. Emily's doing heroic work, dropping the links in the chat, but happy to answer any questions. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Ava. That was covering a lot in a small amount of time, so I really appreciate it. And yeah, there's a good and thank you, Emily, for sending those links. These are the teammates we need. But okay, we can move along to our next presentation, still along this line of state climate policy trends, just covering some other sort of sectors and policies that are going on. We have our very own Ruby Wincele, who's the policy and research manager here at Climate XChange. She manages our state climate policy dashboard, which I sent a link to earlier, and really serves as CXC's in-house policy tracker and expert on state climate policy landscape. She also researches the economic, social, and environmental benefits of state climate policy and provides pro bono technical assistance to policymakers and advocates in our network working to pass equitable climate policy in their states. So I will go ahead and hand it to Ruby, and I'll just say one more time, recording, slides, and recap article of this event will be sent out to you via email and posted on our website by the end of the week. So no worries there. But yeah, I'll hand it over to you, Ruby. Thanks for being here today.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Kristen did a great job introducing me and what I do at Climate XChange. I manage our dashboard. I encourage you to check it out. We have 65 different climate policies across seven different policy areas on that site, and we're hoping to add even more policies over time. One thing that informs the dashboard, and then we also have a biweekly newsletter where we share state and federal policy updates. We also do a ton of internal policy tracking. So I'll be highlighting some additional trends in the legislature, and then I have a slide on a whole bunch of other things to keep an eye out, both in state legislatures, but also other avenues of policymaking. So jumping back to the electricity sector, we're seeing a lot of bills introduced around community solar. This is a policy on our dashboard. It's called Shared Renewables. We pull in data and policy components from Spot for Clean Energy. And you can see if you are exploring the dashboard, around 47 states do have some component of shared renewables or community solar. But we've seen 40 bills across 17 states looking to either expand existing programs or establish pilot programs or just establish programs in general. I'll also add a disclaimer, we're still actively tagging bills and tracking them. So if you don't see a state or a bill mentioned, it's not because it doesn't fall within these categories. We're just a team of two working on this policy tracking, and there are thousands of bills to review. So 10 states are looking to expand their existing programs. That's either increasing program capacity, expanding customer eligibility, making it easier for people to participate in them. An interesting bill is in California that would require at least 51% of a community solar project's capacity to serve low-income customers. There are bills in Washington that require 30% to be reserved for low-income subscribers. In New Jersey, there are a couple bills that would make it easier for low and moderate income households to participate in those programs. Oregon is bills would increase program capacity, and they would also incentivize battery storage with solar projects as well. And also seeing some exciting legislation to establish community solar pilots and programs. You'll see Missouri actually has the most bills under consideration to establish community solar. There are a couple to just establish a program outright, and then there are a couple bills as well to create 3-year pilot programs before jumping into a long-term program. Next slide, please. On the topic of utility reform, there's also a lot to get into here. As Ava mentioned, energy affordability is a really big concern across most states. This slide, however, focuses on prohibiting utilities from charging ratepayers for certain activities, looking at political activities and other expenses like trade association dues, lobbying, charitable contributions, political contributions, stuff like that. 8 states have introduced bills like this, and another bill in Rhode Island would prohibit public utilities from including certain advertising expenses unless it's specifically informational and educational around public safety and conservation. This has been a big trend last couple years. 3 states, Colorado, Connecticut, and Maine, successfully passed legislation in 2023. There were a ton of bills introduced in 2024, and we're seeing that momentum continue in 2025. So 12 bills across 8 states right now, and we are expected to see a couple more states try and hold utilities accountable this way. Next slide. So in addition to a lot of sector-specific policies on the dashboard, we do have a policy area called Climate Governance and Equity. This focuses on how states are setting climate targets, climate planning, building out government capacity to address climate concerns, incorporate environmental justice into climate policy, and more. So this term of environmental justice bureaucracy is kind of getting at how states are, building out that capacity and staffing to address environmental justice, bake environmental justice into climate policy and planning, and kind of better meld the two areas of climate mitigation and environmental justice. So, so far we've seen 10 bills across 8 states. 5 of these would create new offices and EJ staff level positions. Texas, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania would create new offices of environmental justice. In New Jersey, it would be an Office of Clean Energy Equity within the Public Utility Department. And we're also seeing a bill in Illinois to expand the responsibilities of the Office of Environmental Justice within their EPA. There's a bill in New Mexico that would require state agencies to prioritize emission reductions in environmental justice communities and kind of consider EJ impacts in their emissions inventories and in climate rulemaking as well. On the advisory body side, 2 states kind of focus on this. Texas, there's a bill that would create an environmental justice advisory council as well as an environmental justice review board to advise that council. And then 2 states, Colorado and Delaware, would expand or extend existing advisory bodies. So Delaware has a Justice 40 commission, and that was extended through 2026. In Colorado, there's a bill to add youth representation to their EJ advisory body. Yep, and there I see a comment around the EPA shutting down all of their offices of environmental justice. So it is even more important for states to establish their own state level offices and staff. I guess the one state I didn't mention that's on this slide is Minnesota, and that would be creating a new EJ staff position within the Department of Transportation. Next slide. Also within our climate governance and equity policy area is a handful of just transition policies. So we are seeing a lot of movement on that as well, 24 bills in 9 states. A lot of states are considering legislation to create just transition plans. So looking at how to support communities, workers, and industries affected by the transition away from fossil fuels. A lot of these plans need to have an analysis of the potential impacts of that, identifying vulnerable populations and workers, and then also making recommendations on how to address their needs, build out workforce development programs and policies, and really support the retraining of impacted workers. So 5 states would require a statewide plan. An interesting highlight is in Florida. Their bill is a House and Senate version focused on 100% renewables by 2050 and setting a net zero emission target by 2051. Part of this bill is also would create a renewable energy workforce development advisory committee, long title, but it would have to make recommendations on how the state can support displaced energy workers impacted by the transition to 100% clean energy. In addition to statewide plans, Massachusetts is also considering bills that would require each gas utility to submit just transition plans. So this is, again, specifically focused on the gas transition and kind of ending fossil fuel use in the state. Some of those bills, Senate Bill 2276 would also require employers in the energy sector who are either directly involved or likely to be involved in transitional steps away from fossil fuels to submit their own just transition plans as well. And on the bureaucracy and funding front, a lot of those same states are considering building out new advisory bodies and kind of agency capacities. So, for example, a couple of those bills in Massachusetts would create a just transition office within the state's Executive Office of Labor and Workforce Development. And an example of a funding program, a bill in New Mexico would provide $25 million to training programs for workers to transition to non-extractive industries over the next couple years. Next slide, please. So that was only a subset of the trends. I realize this is a lot of information, but I did want people on the call and who will be reviewing the recording and the slides to just see what else is out there. A lot of really exciting movement in the building decarbonization and the gas transition. So states considering requiring all electric new construction, a cohort of states considering clean heat standards, particularly in kind of the Northeast region and a couple states in the Midwest, establishing building performance standards for states that don't have them, or increasing the number of buildings that would have to comply with existing BPSs, thermal energy networks, and gas transition pilots. So piloting 10, studying their feasibility, stuff like that, and then ending gas pipeline subsidies or requirements that new customers need to be connected to the gas system, or kind of ending policies to replace aging gas infrastructure. On the transportation front, in addition to what Ava mentioned, another cohort of states are considering low carbon fuel standards, setting VMT and or emission reduction targets for the transportation system. In electricity, a lot of movement around siting and permitting reform. So seeing some considerations around local control of that, state control of that, kind of different approaches to consolidate and speed up siting and permitting approval. Also, some states are considering the impacts of energy siting to natural and working lands. Washington is an example of that. And then industry, a lot of states are looking at methane regulations for oil and gas operations and from landfills as well. And then on the right, a couple like cross-cutting topics and stuff, just aligning planning processes with climate and clean energy goals. So this is for utility planning. Some states have some like future of gas proceedings, transportation system planning as well. And then, as I mentioned on a previous slide, prioritizing emission reductions in EJ communities, as well as considering cumulative impacts of existing and new facilities. And thanks so much. I'll send my contact information in the chat. And I also forgot to mention, Climate XChange publishes typically mid-year recaps as well as annual trends. So a lot of these are kind of building on what we've seen in 2023 and 2024. So I'll just send our 2024 policy recap with a couple trends that we are expected to continue this year as well.
Thank you so much, Ruby. I saw someone asked in the chat if we'll be updating these counts in states for topics as sessions progress. As Ruby said, we'll do like a kind of mid-year trends article that's recapping this sort of stuff. But we also, if you are subscribed to our newsletter, every 2 weeks we send out updates on policy progress in these and other sectors. So keep an eye out there. All right, we can go to the next slide. And we will transition now from kind of talking about what trends we're seeing in states and transition into what opportunities states have, looking at some modeling of policies and their impacts on different sorts of state level factors. So we have Alicia Zhao, research manager at the Center for Global Sustainability, coming out of the University of Maryland. As CGS's US modeling lead, Alicia uses quantitative analysis and energy systems modeling to understand national decarbonization pathways and the roles that subnational climate actors can play. Her work has contributed to the formulation of and discussion around US climate targets as well. And so I will hand it over to you, Alicia. Thank you so much for being here. And yeah, take it away. We can go to the next slide.
Great. Thanks so much, Kristen. If you go to the next slide, before diving in, I just wanted to give you a little background on our modeling work and how it's evolved over the years since we're relatively new to this network. So since 2017, CGS, Center for Global Sustainability, we've been analyzing and publishing work on this all of society approach toward climate action, so including federal actors, but also non-federal actors. And this started out as an effort to show that states, cities, businesses, and other non-federal actors could still play an important role in addressing climate change, despite inaction in the federal government. And so over the many years, we've developed this process where we try to understand what the US can do in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions across economy-wide sectors with contributions from these non-federal actors. And we're able to do this through a combination of our field leading modeling tool, which has resolution for 50 states, as well as policy engagement and stakeholder consultation. And I will say that much of this work was done in partnership with America's All In, which is the largest coalition of non-federal actors in the US that are striving to achieve the Paris climate goals. And so in this particular presentation, I want to highlight 2 products. So first, our report on how the US can achieve a high ambition 2035 climate target through concrete policy actions across all of society, this was released at Climate Week last year in September. And then also our follow-on analysis, which was released after the general election. And it shows how even with uncertainty in federal action, stepped up ambition from non-federal actors can still help the US achieve an ambitious 2035 target. Next slide. So an important part of our report was this stakeholder engagement process that we led with America's All In. We did have an initial version of our 2035 pathways analysis ready early last year. And so March through July of 2024, we worked with All In and we held over 12 listening sessions across different sectors. And you can see here, there were over 200 attendees with organizations from federal and state to city and industry, covering a pretty wide spectrum across sectors. And during these sessions, we would get feedback on both our modeling assumptions and also feedback around key implementation barriers and challenges. And this feedback also helped inform our implementation pathway section of the report, where we outline concrete policies that actors across all of society can implement in order to help achieve this decarbonization pathway that we're seeing. And I'll be going over that a little later in this presentation. Next slide. So just looking at the results in our report, we have this current policy scenario, which includes all of the on-the-books policies at the federal and non-federal levels. So that includes things like the Inflation Reduction Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, and then also the EPA standards on vehicle tailpipe emissions and power plants, and also state-level policies like renewable portfolio standards and EV sales targets. So all of that can get us to 48% greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2035. And in our enhanced emission scenario, we layer new and expanded policies on top of our current policies scenario. And these actions are coming from both federal and non-federal actors. Next slide. So this slide just breaks down in the enhanced emissions sector how we can get to that 65% emissions reduction. And you can see here we have historical emissions from 2005, 2020, and from there we have the emissions reductions across all of the sectors. So two things I want to note here is that we do get the most reductions from the electricity and transport sectors, so there's the largest potential there. However, reductions are needed across all of the sectors, including buildings, industry, methane, and we categorize some of the smaller sectors into this other sector category to get to that 65% number. Next slide. So looking at this is our follow-on analysis, which was released again after the election. And we basically looked at what non-federal actors can do under potential federal rollbacks. And what we find is that they can counter much of these rollbacks, and depending on the level of the rollback, help achieve 54 to 62% greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2035, which falls within the range of the 2035 US nationally determined contribution. And so this is represented by this blue band here called the non-federal leadership scenario. And then our previous enhanced ambition is below that, and then current policies is above that on the chart. And you can compare this to the 33 to 43% emissions reductions that we would get if there are rollbacks, but non-federal actors just maintain their existing actions. That's the 33 to 43%, the orange band labeled federal rollbacks on this chart. So basically quite a substantial difference depending on whether or not non-federal actors enhance their actions. Next slide. And so now I just want to quickly walk you through what policies we're modeling in our non-federal leadership scenario to get to that 54 to 62% figure. So since there is a lot of uncertainty around what's going to happen on the federal end, we provide a range of ambition. So the lowest end of the range is a complete repeal of both existing federal regulations and legislation after 2025. So this would include recent EPA regulations on power plants and tailpipe emissions, and also various provisions from the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law. And then we can see the highest end of the range, which is fairly optimistic. It assumes that we don't have any new federal policies, but existing policies are maintained and then enhanced after a new administration comes in after 2028. So all of these federal assumptions are paired with enhanced non-federal action across all sectors. With these potential rollbacks, that would mean losing a lot of the emissions reductions that we're getting in the scenarios that I showed you before. So it's important for states to step up with their own actions to counter these impacts. So you can see here's a summary of the different actions that span across sectors, from clean electricity targets to EV sales targets to oil and gas methane intensity standards, industry carbon capture and sequestration, and more. Next slide. However, enhancing these actions isn't going to be that simple in reality, as I'm sure you all know. So it will require overcoming several challenges and barriers. So as a part of our stakeholder engagement process, we did identify what some of these barriers could look like. And so just wanted to share here what we got out of these sessions. So in terms of overarching themes, legal challenges at the federal, state, and local levels, a lot of uncertainty around policy implementation and uptake. Stakeholders emphasize the importance of educating people on the various tax credits and incentives that are applicable for them, and just making sure they know how to use them. And there's also a lot of federal funds that rely on state implementation. And some state agencies are having trouble tracking these and also lack the technical expertise. Stakeholders also identified the need to build feasibility and accountability into the goals that are being set. Another issue that came up is regional cooperation. So more collaboration is needed between states as well as with local jurisdictions to help efficiently utilize federal funds and also help with interregional projects like transmission planning. Cross-sectoral collaboration is another challenge, since a lot of these decarbonization policies are very intersectional. So for example, partnerships between states, utilities, buildings, and automakers can help ensure that, the electrification infrastructure network is connected. And As a last point, they also stress the lack of state-led incentives and anticipatory investments. So, for example, states can offer more carrots to encourage decarbonization with things like EV rebates, state-funded EV programs, manufacturing programs, and so forth. And also, just there's a need to be more proactive in clean energy investments since it can take a lot of time to permit and build things. In terms of sector-specific challenges, as it has been mentioned before, streamlining permitting and siting processes is a big one. There's, a lot of discussion around federal permitting, but states can also set their own permitting reform. For example, Washington State did this recently. Inadequate transmission and EV infrastructure. So it's especially important to increase EV infrastructure to different communities, especially those that live in multifamily housing and renters. Reducing vehicle miles traveled, that came up earlier today as well. That will require, kind of reimagining design and planning decisions around communities in order to decrease the dependence on personal vehicles. And also scaling up different new technologies like hydrogen and carbon capture sequestration. Right now, they're not really commercially available. So, we need to do the work now to ensure that they can help us with emissions reductions in the future. And lastly, for the sector-specific issue, the issue of split incentive. So, for example, in the building sector, landlords don't directly benefit from making energy efficiency upgrades or installing EV charging equipment, since it's the renters that get the benefits. So they're not as incentivized to do that. Next slide. And so in an effort to address some of these barriers, we also laid out specific implementation pathways for different actors across all of society. So here I'm just highlighting the actions that are most relevant for states, but you can see our report for more detail. And most of these actions already exist in some states, so there's already some momentum behind them. And in the interest of time, I'll be covering implementation pathways for electricity, transport, and methane sectors. And these are some key sectors where we could see enhanced actions from states in the face of federal rollbacks. However, decarbonizing other sectors like buildings, industry, and lands are also important. So if you're curious about that, you can find more detail in our report as well. So for the electricity sector, state governments can help ramp up clean energy and phase out fossil fuels. A lot of this has been mentioned, so I'll kind of just quickly go through them. Increasing investments in transmission storage and modernizing the grid, adopting clean energy targets, adopting permitting reform, carbon pricing, coal securitization to help retire coal plants, and training a clean energy workforce. Next slide. And for the transport sector, increasing state governments can help increase EV adoption while also, bringing down the vehicle miles traveled. So this can include policies like EV sales targets, such as the ones that California has, the Advanced Clean Cars 2 and Advanced Clean Trucks. There are also EV tax credits and rebates that states can use to incentivize customers to purchase EVs. Investing in EV infrastructure, especially in communities that have difficulty accessing it. And then also using federal funds for public transit or EVs instead of highway funding. And lastly, promoting micromobility. So that was one that was very interesting that came up in our stakeholder engagement sessions. So things like e-bikes and scooters. For example, Colorado has this point of sale e-bike rebate program. And the city of Madison, Wisconsin has this community pass program where basically they allow library card holders to check out a bike helmet and a week-long pass to the city's bike share program for free. Next slide. And finally, methane. So this is a very important sector for near-term emissions reductions that doesn't quite get talked about as much as electricity and transport. But states can play a big role in helping to increase methane abatement across various sectors. I will say that oil and gas is one of the biggest sectors for states to target, since much of the methane emissions associated with oil and gas extraction can be mitigated at a relatively low cost and sometimes at a net profit. So things like oil and gas methane intensity standards, there's actually a target coming out of COP28 where I think over 50 oil and gas companies signed on to reduce their oil and gas methane intensity to 0.2%, I believe. leak detection and repair programs, bans on routine flaring and venting, plugging orphan and idle wells, and better manure management practices can help reduce methane emissions from the agriculture sector, which does take up a large part of methane emissions. And of course, zero waste targets and landfill regulations are also important for methane emissions that come from waste. Next slide. So just in conclusion, the US has made a lot of progress toward its near-term climate targets. So it's just important to remember that and try to defend what we do have in place at both the federal and non-federal levels. The second point is that even though federal leadership is really important, non-federal actors can still have a significant impact on emissions reductions. And in terms of what we're trying to do next with our analyses is we're trying to link these low carbon transition scenarios to broader societal benefits. So looking at things like what are the health impacts and economic impacts associated with keeping the IRA versus not having the IRA in a federal rollback scenario. So stay tuned for that. We should be having more work out on that later this year. And that's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Alicia. We can go to the next slide. So we've presented kind of a bunch of different trends that we're seeing and opportunities that may or may not align with those trends. I want to just take a second to open up a poll for you all and ask which of some of these topics you'd be interested in learning more about through upcoming events that are hosted by Climate XChange. I just launched that poll, so it should be a pretty quick one. You can select more than one, but just kind of thinking about your top trends that you maybe could use more support on. And then the second question is asking about which of those topics you're currently working on. So I'm just going to leave that open for a minute or so. It should be super quick. Thank you. We're already seeing at least a quarter of you have responded. This is super helpful to just make sure that our programming is as actionable for you guys as possible. We can go ahead and stop screen sharing and we'll move into the Q&A portion of the call. We have just under 10 minutes left, so we'll probably be able to answer a couple questions. But I will just keep this poll open for just a little longer so folks can answer super quickly. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to add those to the Q&A and we can get started. So I will keep that poll open for just a minute or so, and we can go into some questions here. One of them is about, we talked a lot about kind of opportunities and trends that would continue furthering and upping climate ambition. Do any of you want to talk about any sign of retrenchment of climate policies or GHG targets? Any kind of backwards movement in a lot of that kind of general GHG emissions and climate policies generally?
Yeah, I can speak on that. I think that there is a lot of fear following the November elections and looking at some of the outcomes and affordability is such a big crisis right now. And so there is a little bit of fear. And I think that what we're trying to show, and like maybe Emily, my link queen, can help put this in the chat here, but we're really trying to highlight this story of in Washington State, their cap and invest program was on the ballot to be repealed, and that had the highest, it's like a little bit of a double negative, but it was defeated by a really high percentage, a higher percentage than any of the statewide office, showing that there was this overwhelming majority of support for the program. And I think that really shows when you have climate programs and you can communicate that benefits to the constituents in a way that impacts their real life. These programs are overwhelmingly powerful, so are overwhelmingly popular. So I think, you can take something from the affordability crisis that we're having right now and say, okay, when we need to really demonstrate how climate programs and investing in clean energy is going to have a meaningful benefit on the average person's life and make it really tangible. So I think you can counteract that fear with some positivity. Oop. Yeah, let me grab the link.
Alrighty. Thank you so much, Ava. I can see that link there in the chat from Emily. I also have a question here about a trend that wasn't mentioned here, definitely has been big in the last couple years around anti-ESG bills at the city or state level. Would love if any of you could touch on how you're seeing that this year in comparison to previous years. It's definitely been a rising trend for sure.
I can hop in. I can't answer, has it been, have more states introduced anti-ESG bills this year compared to previous years off the top of my head. It is a trend. We all are also seeing the opposite trend where states are also introducing pro ESG and public divestment policies. So I do feel like anti-ESG is getting a lot of attention, but there are kind of states trying to counteract that and pass bills to require public disclosures, public divestment, ESG, or not ESG, like requiring companies to publicly report and disclose their emissions, stuff like that. So, yeah.
Yes, definitely think that is a trend. I mean, I think it's been a trend for the past couple of years. I just popped in the chat our climate finance briefing book. It kind of gets at like the not necessarily, we're not highlighting the bills, but sort of the language that gets out of anti-ESG bills. Because I think some of those bills sometimes can be like masking. And so really calling out that language can be really helpful to say, no, this seems like it could be a good thing, but it's certainly not. So put that link in the chat there too.
Thank you very much. I'll also just note that our wonderful panelists are answering a lot of questions through just typing them into the Q&A. So also feel free to look at that. We'll include the typed questions and answers also in our recap. So no worries if you can't get it all down. We have another question, Alicia. This is just a quick question for you on the emissions graph that you showed with different sectors. Are emissions from the agriculture sector captured in that other bucket?
Yes, we do include agricultural emissions. And this is actually based on, if you're curious about that, it's actually based on a previous report that we released, the America's All-in Climate Action on Lands. So I'm happy to link that if you're interested. But it was fed directly from the results from that model, which is a model that's worked on previous agriculture emissions projections.
Great, thank you so much. We are close to the end of the hour here, so I will go ahead and close us out today. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for answering our survey, which I'm going to go ahead and end here. And then launch another survey. Woo, feedback is important. Thank you guys. Just to let us know if that was useful for you. Yeah, so thank you so much. As always, all of our events are recorded. A recap article and the recording and the slides will be sent out via email by the end of the week. And you can also see it. It'll be posted on our website along all of our other previous webinars. I'm going to go ahead and just send my email once more in the chat, but you guys all registered for this event, so it's probably in your inbox already. If you have any questions or if you'd like to be put in contact with any of the speakers here today. And then lastly, if you're interested in staying on top of trends, not only what is being enacted, but also what is being considered, every month at the end of the month, we have our State Climate Policy Network National Call. The next one is on March 26th, where members from the network will all come together and provide some updates on what their state has been up to in the past couple months regarding climate, clean energy, environmental policy. And so that's a great time to just kind of like tune in and get a bird's eye view of what's happening across the country. thank you all again. If you haven't submitted that poll about how useful or not useful this event was for you, please do so. And feel free to reach out to us. All of our speakers are wonderful, and you can connect with them after the session if you would like. So yeah, thank you everyone. Keep on chugging. It is a tough time, and I say this every single event, but it gets no less true each time. Make sure that you are, even in the midst of a lot of work to do, that you are taking care of yourself and taking a step back, because we need to be sustainable as a movement, and burnout is all over the place. So you can't solve everything today. Please take time to care for yourself and your community. Thank you all. I have said thank you many times, but this is the end of the webinar now. Thanks to our speakers and attendees. Have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. But yeah, bye y'all.
Thanks, everyone.